And good afternoon. Welcome to my live stream, which I'm doing Monday through Friday. Charles Moscowitz here. You're welcome to join the program. I'm taking calls 617-396-4830. 617-396-4830 is the number. The big story today is the hoax pulled off by Empire actor Jussie Smollett, who apparently, and again, it's not 100% confirmed, so I want to be clear about that, but there is testimony from two men who were interviewed by the Chicago Police Department, who now say that they were paid by Jussie Smollett, one of whom is his personal trainer, and I think the other guy's the trainer's brother, and to basically set up this hoax by which he would allege that he was attacked by two white guys with racial and homophobic epithets at 2 o'clock in the morning in Chicago. Very inflammatory stuff. You know, this is the kind of stuff that could trigger a major race conflagration, as it did, for example, in Ferguson, Missouri. It reminds me of the Trayvon Martin case and other same such cases. Well, it's turned out that this one looks to be a complete hoax, which is interesting because it was flying along quite well, since it fit in with the mainstream media leftist narrative, the cultural narrative that we have to live with in this country, which is that anyone that supports President Trump, and by the way, these guys allegedly were, wearing MAGA hats and yelling, this is Trump country, which it's suspicious anyways. But the narrative being that anyone who supports the president and his administration must have something against black men and women, must have something against gay people, must have something against Muslims, must have something against someone to motivate them from supporting this president who is continually labeled with those kinds of lies. And that Jussie Smollett, from what I understand, he had been written off the script of his television program, Empire, probably trying to get some publicity, maybe trying to create an incident that would put him in the headlines. I mean, he has become pretty widely known since this event, that he did this for publicity, assumedly. Plus, apparently, he was a absolutely vicious Trump hater, and is on record as such. And I think he figured, and to a certain extent rightfully, that the media narrative would play along with him, and they did. There's some interesting clips up on YouTube showing clip after clip of big media figures and people, congressional presidential candidates like Kamala Harris and apparently Nancy Pelosi, saying, "Oh, this is true, and this is another example of how evil America is." Wink, wink, meaning technical issue here, and the usual narrative. All right, we're still getting audio. The fact is that if there's one thing we can learn from this, which is classic fake news, it's that these sorts of hoaxes or these sorts of exaggerations have been going on for a long time, and they've increased substantially in this past maybe 5 or 10 years. We know that, for example, the Russians, the one thing we've learned from the Russian investigation is that Russian bots, as it were, and Russian agents have continued to do what they used to do back in the old days of the Soviet Union, and that is engage in dialectical conflict to try to create and to weaken a culture and a society. So when there is an incident, they are the ones that are going to not only magnify it and make it bigger than it is, but they're also going to try to play both sides against each other as a way to create conflict and division and a breakdown in a society. And apparently that's exactly what they did, according to congressional testimony, in both the Trayvon Martin and the Ferguson case. They know that America has an Achilles heel when it comes to race relations. So they chose to fan those flames and throw gasoline on those fires on both sides. Probably did it in Charlottesville too, where they basically they conflated events and made them into much worse than they were, and rang it up the flagpole as a way to create division. Well, if there's one thing we could learn about this particular hoax, and again, it's not 100% proven, but it looks like a flat-out hoax, it's that a lot of these stories are politicized and propagandized in a way that we ought to be very careful about before jumping to judgment. Another one I would add to this was that those instances at the University of Missouri, remember that? Yazoo, or whatever they called the university, where you had a couple of alleged anti-Semitic and racist incidents that blew way out of proportion and turned out largely to be untrue, but it caused riots, practically destroyed the college. With the Trayvon Martin case, right? We now know that the tape where Officer Zimmerman had made comments that appeared racist as he reported seeing Trayvon Martin at this gated community, that tape was doctored. I don't think there's any question about that. I believe it was CNN that did it. That there were questions about whether or not, they had gotten into a fight, who was the aggressor, who actually threw the first punch, what actually happened in that fight that led to Trayvon Martin's death, unfortunately. The third aspect was that the picture that the media went out with of Trayvon Martin was old. It was like when he was still, I think 13, 14 years old, and he was an innocent, fresh-faced kid, with a little hoodie on, and he looked like your regular all-American neighbor, when in fact that's not what Trayvon Martin looked like at the time of this event. He was a big, brawny, kind of slightly scary-looking guy. And the fourth thing we find out is that Zimmerman was not white. Not that race matters, but this was a race story, that he actually was, I think, Portuguese, Afro-Portuguese background. So the media created and molded this story in a classic piece of propaganda. They did it just before the 2014 election to try to help Obama get elected by reminding people with a huge dog whistle that people that aren't supporters of Obama have something against him because he's black, which of course is a lie, and something against black people. And thus, here we have this incident to remind us that America still has a major race problem, when really the whole thing was not concocted. It was an incident, and this man lost his life. Shouldn't have happened, of course. It was wrong. And yeah, there was a race component to it. But it was crafted in such a way to fit a political agenda and a cultural agenda. Same thing with Ferguson. It was not the way it was initially reported, where he put his hands in the air and said, "Please don't shoot," and that the officer shot him in the back. That's not what happened. He charged the officer. He was high on some kind of controlled substance. He had just robbed a store, and that he tried to grab the officer's gun, and then the officer shot him. Now, does that mean he should have been shot? No. The officer was wrong was inexperienced, but to make this into an incident where policemen would be condemned like that, and then of course it was used as an excuse to create Black Lives Matter, which started out as a pretty bad group. I think they've reformed since, but they started out really with responsibility for the murders of several policemen, including two policemen who were sitting in their cruiser in Queens. Both of whom, by the way, happened to not be white. One was Asian, the other Hispanic, who was shot dead in cold blood by a man who said he was inspired by Black Lives Matter. So their racist, rhetoric and their protests, and they had this rally where they're like, "Fry them like bacon," or some weird thing like that. "Pigs in a blanket," that kind of inflammatory stuff did lead to the deaths of several policemen. I believe there was also a connection between that and the shooting of several policemen, both in Dallas and in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So since then, they've toned it down. But the point I'm making is that this kind of framing by the media of a particular event, in this case Ferguson, which led to riots in that city and the looting of predominantly black businesses, is something that is done because it fits a leftist cultural and political narrative. Now, in that case, I think the real story was, why was it that the police department in Ferguson had military-grade weapons that what they were using against Americans? And that the Obama administration, apparently, their Defense Department had handed out these weapons to local police departments around the country. To me, that was the real story there. But instead, it was again blown up into this thing where we are all to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, aren't we evil because we're racist? Because if we're white, and especially if we're conservative, we must have something against black men and women. And it's this kind of divisive rhetoric and this kind of divisive framing by the establishment media that not only creates a racist incident and fans the flames of racism that is there, of course, but is very convenient in terms of their using these sorts of things to further their authoritarian agenda. And this is not new. It goes back. I mean, we could look at instances in American history. The Leo Frank trial in Atlanta was framed as an anti-Semitic incident when it really wasn't. Leo Frank was the manager of a local manufacturing company in Atlanta, a pencil making company. He was abusive toward women. There were several reports of this. Physically abusive. A very, very bad man. He ends up being convicted of rape and murder of this young girl, Phelan, who he called into her office on a day off when the whole plant was closed, and the accusation being that he tried to rape her and that she died. And then he tried to blame it in the trial on the watchman, who happened to be black, by using the most racist arguments. It had nothing to do with the fact that Leo Frank happened to be Jewish or of Jewish background. And generally, the South had a reputation for not being anti-Semitic. If anything, they had a very cordial relation with Jews who lived in the big cities and who often were shop owners and department store owners many times, and that there was kind of a symbiotic relationship between the Jews and the non-Jews in those cities that went all the way back to the Civil War, when Jews played a role in the Confederacy, including the chief advisor to Jefferson Davis, that being Judah Benjamin, and others. So it wasn't really an anti-Semitic thing, but it was made into an anti-Semitic thing by the lawyers and by Jewish organizations, frankly, from the North, who were just forming at that time, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, who turned it into an anti-Semitic cause célèbre. And, the result was that Leo Frank, who was convicted of murder and who was in prison, the governor at that time, Slayton, he commuted Frank's sentence. And the community was outraged, and he ended up being kidnapped from prison and lynched by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I'm not saying that that's right. That was a terrible crime. But the governor apparently was also a lawyer in the office of the law firm that had been hired to defend Leo Frank. So there was a major conflict of interest. And that governor had to leave the state. I think it was his last day in office anyways, when he did the commutation, and he didn't return to Georgia for another 10 years. So clearly Leo Frank was not exactly a sterling member of the community. And the fact that he happened to be of Jewish background should have been a great cause of disgrace for the Jews. And certainly I feel embarrassed that this man was a Jew. It's not exactly somebody I would, call up when I'm bragging about being a Jew. But it was made into this thing mainly by propaganda, financed by organizations that became in the business of fanning these kinds of flames, and still are in many cases. And I only bring that up to illustrate my point here, which is this is exactly what went through Jussie Smollett's head when he set this, apparently, allegedly, set this whole thing up. He knew that it could become a major national story, just like the Trayvon Martin story, and that the main fuel for the story would be the element by which he added an attack on President Trump and his followers. Because we all know that President Trump has something against black people, and so do his followers, so here we have proof. Well, the fact is that there has been an uptick in these sorts of attacks in this country, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is not a group that I would in any way endorse. I think that they're very corrupted. They only report mainly on leftist, on attacks that are other than leftist. And they've attacked people that are solid conservative people, like David Horowitz and others. But they do say that there's been an uptick in these events. What they don't tell you is that most of these events are actually attacks on Trump supporters, not his opponent, not the other way around. So the lesson here is let's watch. There's one thing we can learn, and President Trump has brought it out to the fore in a way that really no one else ever has, and that is that we have to watch for fake news. We have to be careful not to jump on these bandwagons, to step back. I mean, the Covington High School kids incident. I mean, a very close friend of mine said to me, "Oh, these people are haters and racists, and anybody who disagrees is a hater and a racist." Well, turned out that was a hoax too. So we have to be very careful. If we can learn anything as citizens, it's to educate ourselves, to step back regardless of our political orientation, and not get so excited and jump on these witch hunt bandwagons, because that's how people end up getting burned at the stake. Let's don't be that kind of society. Let's not be those sorts of people. Let's be people who can responsibly and appropriately learn to govern ourselves first, and as such be self-governing people in a nation and in a culture that protects freedom and truth, as opposed to mob rule. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone, and I shall return, God willing, tomorrow at 12 noon. You're listening to Charles Moscowitz live stream. Please subscribe on YouTube. I'd appreciate it if you do. Just click on subscribe. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. It's anonymous. Your name doesn't appear anywhere. If you don't want to stay, you can unsubscribe. But it would be very helpful to me if you do subscribe on YouTube. Thanks for watching, everyone.